Toddler found a German shepherd locked inside a dark shed. What happened next left everyone crying. They said no one could survive. They said she should walk away. But one little girl refused to give up, and what she did next turned her into a symbol of hope for thousands. This isn't just another feel-good story. This is the story. Like, share, and tell us where you're from, you won't forget this. The morning had begun the way countless mornings did in the little countryside village. Quiet, unhurried, and wrapped in a blanket of fog that still clung low to the fields. The rooster had crowed, the hens scratched lazily at the damp earth, and the smell of dew on grass mixed with the faint smoke from chimneys. Life seemed slow, predictable, safe. It was the kind of morning where children's laughter carried easily across the stillness, where even the softest sound echoed in the silence of the village. In the middle of this hushed dawn, a toddler waddled near her family's small garden, her laughter bright against the heavy air. She was only just discovering the joy of chasing butterflies and pulling at flower petals, her tiny hands smeared with damp soil. To the adults, she was simply playing, harmless and happy. To her, the world was still wide, new, and full of wonder. She giggled as the fog swirled around her, clapping her hands at the sight of a fluttering bird taking off from a fence post. But then, something unusual broke through the stillness. Faint at first, like a whisper hidden inside the fog, came a sound, scratching, desperate, uneven. The little girl froze, her head tilting, listening with a seriousness far beyond her years. Again the sound, a muffled whine, a cry pressed against wood and silence. Her wide eyes turned toward the old shed standing crooked at the edge of the yard. It had long been forgotten, its door chained with rust, its roof sagging beneath years of weather and neglect. To the grown-ups, it was just an abandoned place, nothing more. But the child's small finger lifted, pointing toward it. Inside, she babbled, tugging at her mother's skirt, eyes fixed on the shed. At first, the adults brushed it off, smiling at her imagination. A creak of old wood, a bird nesting, perhaps a rat scurrying, it was nothing to worry about. But the toddler was insistent. Again and again she pointed, her laughter gone now, replaced by an urgency she couldn't quite explain. Her little voice, broken into fragments, carried one truth: there was something inside. Neighbors, drawn by curiosity, began to gather, whispering as they followed her tiny gestures. The sound came again, clearer this time. Not a bird, not a rat. A long, aching whimper, followed by the frantic scratching of claws against wood. A hush fell over the group. Faces grew pale, questions whispered in the cold air. Is something trapped? Who could have locked the shed? What if it's dangerous? The child stood firm, her fingers still pointed, her eyes wide with both fear and determination. It was as if she alone understood that whatever was inside was not a threat. It was a plea. Her innocence cut through the hesitation of the crowd, forcing the adults to listen. The men of the village stepped closer, testing the rusted lock that sealed the shed. It rattled, holding firm, as another mournful cry seeped through the cracks. Women clasped their hands over their mouths. Children clutched their parents' coats. The suspense tightened with every second. What could possibly be in there? One man fetched a hammer, another a crowbar. The villagers circled, breathless, as metal clanged against rust. The lock resisted at first, groaning with the weight of years, until finally, snap, the chain fell to the ground. For a moment, silence returned, as if the shed itself was holding its breath. Then, with a push, the door creaked open, dust and darkness spilling into the light. What they saw next froze them in place. Two glowing eyes pierced through the gloom, shining with fear and sorrow. A shape emerged in the shadows. Matted fur, trembling body, claws scraped raw from scratching at the walls. A German shepherd. Exhausted. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his eyes locked onto the light as though it were the first he had seen in years. The crowd gasped in unison, the toddler clutching her mother's hand as though she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. This was no ordinary discovery. This was a secret buried in the silence of their town, a story clawing its way back to life through the eyes of a desperate dog. And so, what began as an ordinary, fog-covered morning was shattered by the sight that left everyone trembling. A German shepherd, locked in a forgotten shed, staring out at them with eyes that told of pain, of loyalty, and of a story yet untold. Life in the little countryside village followed a rhythm so steady that even the smallest change felt like a tremor. For most families, mornings began with the smell of fresh bread rising from clay ovens, the clatter of buckets being carried from the well, and the sound of birds calling from the hedges. Children usually played barefoot in the dirt paths, their giggles weaving into the calm music of the village. Among these children was a little toddler whose world was painted in laughter, innocence, and love. She was the kind of child who could spend an entire morning chasing the golden flicker of butterflies through her family's garden, her tiny hands reaching but never quite catching. Her hair gleamed in the sunlight, her cheeks rosy from the kiss of the cool morning air. Every step she took seemed to carry the purity of a life untouched by fear. Her parents adored her, watching from the porch as she babbled to herself, inventing little stories in the language only children and angels understood. The village itself was a place where safety was assumed. Doors remained unlocked, neighbors borrowed sugar and returned it with pies, and nothing ever seemed to disturb the stillness. It was in this cocoon of peace that the toddler played, her innocence the very heartbeat of a morning that promised nothing unusual. The sun began to burn through the fog, washing the village in warm light. Housewives shook out their laundry, old men leaned on walking sticks as they made their way to morning gatherings. It was a scene so ordinary, so comforting, that none could have imagined how quickly it was about to unravel. The toddler's laughter rang out again as she toddled toward the fence at the edge of the yard. Then, in the middle of her joy, she stopped. Her head tilted, her small lips pressed together in silence. The sound had returned, the faint scratching she had noticed earlier. To her, it wasn't just noise, it was a cry, a voice reaching for her from somewhere unseen. Her finger rose, tiny but determined, pointing straight at the old shed leaning tiredly in the corner of the property. "Inside," she whispered, her voice soft but urgent. Her mother, folding laundry nearby, chuckled and shook her head. "No, darling, it's nothing. Just an old shed." The words were meant to soothe, but the toddler's eyes did not waver. She tugged harder at her mother's skirt, this time louder, her little body almost vibrating with insistence. The sound came again, longer, sharper, impossible to ignore once heard. Curiosity spread like a spark. A neighbor passing by paused, tilting his head toward the shed. Another villager, carrying a basket of eggs, stopped as well. Soon a small circle had formed, all murmuring the same thing. Had they really heard something? Still, skepticism lingered. Adults so often dismissed what children noticed, folding it away as imagination, yet something about her determination unsettled them. The atmosphere shifted. The sunshine that moments ago felt warm and safe now seemed thin, unable to chase away the chill crawling up spines. Shadows stretched long from the trees, and even the birds grew quiet, as though listening. Every villager in that moment carried the same unspoken thought. What if she is right? The men debated in hushed voices. Some insisted it was a trapped bird, others shrugged it off as rats. "The shed has been locked for years," one man said firmly, though his voice betrayed unease. Yet every time the sound came, those desperate claws scratching against wood, followed by a low, mournful whimper, the toddler's face hardened with knowing. She did not have words for it, But she understood. Something alive was inside. Finally, one of the older villagers sighed and stepped forward. "Better to check," he muttered, "just to be sure." His words broke the hesitation. More people approached, forming a tense semicircle around the locked shed. Their footsteps crunched against gravel, their breaths shallow in the growing silence. Women held their children closer, their eyes darting nervously. The toddler stood in the center of it all, her little chest rising and falling quickly, her tiny fingers still aimed at the door as if she were guiding them all. The lock gleamed dull with rust, an ugly scar on the weathered wood. One of the men shook the door. It rattled but did not budge. Another leaned closer, pressing his ear against the gap. His face paled. "There's something in there," he whispered. "Alive." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, fear and curiosity clashing in equal measure. What had begun as a morning of peace now sat heavy with suspense. The villagers glanced at one another, silently asking the same question: what if it's dangerous? But the toddler, too young to know fear, too innocent to imagine danger, tugged again at her mother's dress. Her eyes spoke louder than her words. "Please, don't leave him inside." And so, a day that had promised nothing more than sunshine and laughter twisted into something extraordinary. The ordinary rhythm of the village was broken, replaced by anxious whispers and hesitant steps toward the unknown. The air seemed thicker, the light dimmer, as if even nature was holding its breath. What had begun with the innocent play of a child now carried the weight of a mystery, and the whole village found itself drawn into it, unable to turn away. The old shed creaked as the door swung open, its hinges groaning in protest as though they hadn't moved in years. A stale gust of air rushed out, thick with dust, mold, and the forgotten scent of decay. The villagers covered their mouths, coughing lightly, their eyes straining to adjust to the dimness inside. At first, all they saw were shadows stacked upon shadows, broken tools, rotting planks of wood, and tangled piles of straw. But then, a faint movement cut through the stillness. There, in the farthest corner of the shed, chained to a splintered beam, lay a German shepherd. His once proud body now looked frail, his ribs pressing harshly against his thin coat. His fur was matted with dirt, his paws raw from scratching endlessly at the wooden floor. The chain rattled as he tried to shift, but it allowed him only enough space to pace a few steps before jerking him cruelly back. His eyes, wide and glassy, glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting both fear and something deeper, desperation. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd outside the door. Women clutched their scarves tighter, children ducked behind their mothers. Whispers tumbled over one another. "Whose dog is that? How long has he been here? Why is he chained?" No one had answers. The shed had been abandoned for years, locked and ignored, yet here was a living creature, clinging to life in silence, crying out only when the world outside grew quiet enough to hear. The shepherd's growl rumbled low in his throat, though it was not the snarl of a predator. It was the trembling sound of a soul caught between fight and surrender. His body stiffened at every movement near the door, but his eyes, those aching, sorrowful eyes, seemed to plead with a language more powerful than words. "Help me. Don't leave me here." One of the braver men stepped inside cautiously, holding out his hand. "Easy, boy," he murmured, voice trembling. The shepherd's ears twitched, his body lowering as if preparing to defend himself. The chain rattled violently when the man took another step. Then, with a burst of fear, the dog lunged forward as far as the chain allowed, teeth bared in warning. The man jumped back, heart pounding, retreating quickly toward the doorway. "He's wild," another villager muttered. "No," said an older woman, her eyes fixed on the shepherd. "Not wild. Frightened." The dog whimpered then, a pitiful sound that silenced the whispers. He lowered his head, pressed his body flat against the cold ground, and pawed feebly at the straw. It was as though he wanted to move closer, to bridge the gap between his world and theirs, but every time he tried, panic seized him, forcing him back into the shadows. The toddler, standing among the legs of the grown-ups, peeked inside. Her small face softened at the sight, her lips parting in awe. She didn't see danger. She didn't see a wild animal. She saw someone hurting, someone alone. "Doggy," she whispered, her tiny voice carrying through the silence. The shepherd's ears flicked. For a brief second, his eyes locked onto hers, the growl fading into a soft whine. The villagers noticed the shift but shook it off, returning to their hushed debate. "Who could have done this?" one asked. "Dogs don't chain themselves." The thought sent shivers through the crowd. Was this cruelty? Neglect? Or something else entirely? The questions piled up, heavy and unanswered, as they stared at the trembling creature bound in darkness. Another attempt was made. This time, a younger man placed a piece of bread on the floor just inside the doorway, then backed away slowly. The smell carried into the shed, and the shepherd's nose twitched. Hunger warred with fear. He crept forward, chains scraping against the beam, his paws dragging across the dirt floor. The villagers leaned in, breathless. Just inches away, his body stiffened, his eyes darting nervously to the crowd. Then, with a sudden whimper, he retreated, dragging himself back into the corner, tail tucked tightly against his body. The bread remained untouched. Murmurs rose again. "He doesn't trust us." "Who could blame him?" another replied softly. The toddler tugged once more at her mother's dress. Her eyes never left the shepherd, her little hand outstretched as if she wanted to pull him from the darkness herself. The adults exchanged uneasy glances. They saw danger, sharp teeth, and the potential of attack. But the child saw beyond the growls and the chains. She saw the trembling, the sorrow, the silent plea. The atmosphere in the shed grew heavier, pressing on every chest. The once peaceful morning had transformed into a scene of helplessness, humans and dog alike trapped in fear, separated by years of pain and mistrust. The villagers wanted to help, but the shepherd refused to believe in their kindness. And so the stalemate hung in the air, broken only by the sound of his labored breathing and the faint rattle of his chain. Outside, the sunshine had dimmed behind gathering clouds, as though even the sky felt the weight of the moment. The shed, once just a forgotten structure, now pulsed with a story none of them yet understood, a story buried in the eyes of a dog who both feared and begged for their touch. The villagers lingered at the door, torn between retreat and rescue. But one thing was certain: this shepherd's suffering could not be ignored. The child's persistence had forced open a door long shut, and what they found inside was not only a dog in chains but a mystery that demanded to be unraveled. The German shepherd remained in his corner, trembling yet watchful, caught between defiance and despair. The villagers had seen his eyes, and now none of them could forget. The shed's doorway held the village like a breath, no one willing to exhale, no one ready to turn away. Somewhere behind the cluster of worried faces, the toddler clung to her mother's dupatta, eyes fixed on the trembling shepherd in the corner. The rusty chain pulled and scraped. The dog's chest rose and fell too fast. Then from the back of the crowd, a cane tapped the earth. The people parted to let an old man through. "It used to be Haji Karim's shed," Baba Salim said, voice papery but steady. "May God rest his soul." A murmur ran through the villagers. Haji Karim, the reclusive farmer with a stooped back and a soft smile that appeared only when someone spoke to his dog. Those who had lived in the village long enough could still picture him. A faded cap pinned to his head, cuffs always rolled, and hands that smelled of oil, hay, and the sweetness of ripened wheat. And beside him, as constant as his shadow, walked a German shepherd with the patient gait of an old guard. Every morning, added Amagul, who had sold milk at the corner for as long as anyone remembered. He would stop by my gate. The dog waited at the post, sat there as if he owned time. Didn't touch a drop until Karim Sahib took his first sip of chai. She smiled, then swallowed hard. Such manners, that one. Loyal like a prayer. The people drew closer to the entrance, peering past the gray light into the darker belly of the shed. Dust ribboned in the air, catching on cobwebs like stories that had paused and never resumed. On a hook near the door hung a frayed leather leash, cracked and empty. Beneath it, half buried in straw, lay a small tin bowl with a dent along its rim. Someone nudged it with the toe of a slipper. The bowl spun lazily and settled, facing the dog. "He had a name," whispered Master Iqbal, the retired schoolteacher, as if he were speaking inside a mosque. "Sultan." The dog's name was Sultan. At the sound, the shepherd's ears twitched. His eyes flashed toward the group, a flicker of recognition sparking beneath the glass of fear. The toddler, catching the change, repeated it softly as only a child could, round, warm, unafraid, tone. The vowels fell like breadcrumbs on a path home. The dog's tail moved once, uncertain, then stilled. Memories tugged at the hems of those gathered and led them backward. They saw Haji Karim walking the edge of the wheat fields, a string sack over his shoulder, Sultan weaving behind him through stalks that shimmered like copper under afternoon sun. They saw the two of them outside the hardware shop, the old man fixing a broken buckle while Sultan rested his chin on a boot, eyes half closed, perfectly content. They saw them on rainy evenings, the dog curled on the veranda threshold, nose tucked under tail, while Karim polished his tools under the dim bulb that hummed like a tired fly. No one could remember a day when the two were apart. Then winter came like a visitor who overstays, cold, damp, relentless. For 2 days the fog did not lift. On the third morning, the postman found Haji Karim slumped on a stool in this very shed, eyes closed as if listening for footsteps he knew were near. The village gathered in hush. They told the imam, they brought a shroud, they said the prayers that roll like waves over the shore of a life. And through it all, Sultan stood at the doorway, motionless except for the tremor in his flanks, not letting anyone cross the threshold until someone spoke his name the way his master used to, low, kind, assured. Only then did he step aside. At the graveside, the dog lay his head against the mound of earth and did not move until night folded over the fields. For a few days after, people saw him wander the lane, sniffing the wind, pausing at the butcher's shop where the apprentice always slipped him a bone, waiting outside the little clinic door where Haji once sat for his aching knee. Then one dawn, Sultan vanished as if the fog had swallowed him. "What happened to him?" a boy asked, voice cracking on the question like firewood. Some said a cousin of Karim Sahib tried to take the dog away. Baba Salim replied, eyes on the ground where old boot prints had long ago been erased by rain. Sultan fled. Others said he chased a scent that never existed, the scent of a master who would never again walk these paths. "And the shed?" the milk seller asked, though everyone knew. It stood empty, locked, windows blinded with dust, the roof letting in more moonlight than it should. The wind told no stories here. The walls kept their own counsel. Yet, over the months that followed, little signs appeared, small as sighs. The latch sometimes lay lowered when no one had touched it. A neat oval wore into the straw in one corner, as if a body had made a bed there more than once. On a winter morning, someone found paw prints along the frost by the southern wall, one set, large, deliberate. In spring, a gnawed length of rope turned up beneath the eaves, as if a creature had worried it through many anxious nights. Once, during the harvest festival, a child swore she heard a dog bark just after the fireworks bloomed, not loud, more like a question that had traveled a long way and found no answer. Now the answer stood shivering before them, ribs lathering the skin, eyes like lanterns in a storm. If fear hadn't chained him, something else had, a loop of iron that still smelled faintly of oil, the kind used to lock gates and feed rooms. "This chain," murmured Master Iqbal, kneeling closer but not so close as to startle the shepherd. "It's old. Karim used one like this to secure the thresher." He touched it lightly and looked up. "Someone fixed it to the beam." "Not recently. See the rust? The shame is older than this morning." "Then who?" a man began, anger rising like heat. No one answered. Blame hung in the doorway, heavy and blind. Perhaps scavengers had been coming and someone with more fear than mercy had decided the best guard is a trapped one. Perhaps the dog had been lured and looped, each frightened choice birthing another mistake. Perhaps grief itself had a way of weaving knots that no one intended, until love was tethered to the darkest corner of memory. The toddler tugged at her mother's sleeve again, pointing a little hand toward the bowl at the shepherd's feet. Someone placed water in it. Sultan did not move at first. Then, as if the memory of 1,000 mornings unfurled inside him, he crawled forward on his elbows and drank, each swallow an honest, grateful sound. The village exhaled for the first time. "He has been coming back," Baba Salim said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. He tapped the heel of his cane against the threshold, listening to the old wood speak. "All these years, he has been returning to the only place that still holds the shape of his master. Waiting where the scent remembers. Holding vigil for a door that would not open." The thought settled over them like dusk. Suddenly the shed was not a prison but a shrine, and the chain not merely a cruelty but the visible form of an invisible bond. Love had anchored the dog to the last room where it knew its name, and grief, faithful and stubborn, had stood guard with him. What happens to a heart that has nowhere to go? Amagul whispered, wiping at her eyes with the edge of her shawl. "It circles back. It circles back until someone shows it a new path." The toddler let out a small sound, half laugh, half coo, and wriggled free from her mother's grip. A dozen hands reached to stop her, but she had already taken 2 brave steps into the dimness. The shepherd lifted his head. Their eyes met, the old story and the new beginning waiting inside the same gaze. Outside, a wind moved through the wheat and carried with it the faintest memory of a man's voice. "Sultan, come, son." The dog's ears quivered. The crowd fell silent again. And in that hush, the village finally understood what the child had sensed first. This was not a wild creature to be feared, nor simply a victim to be freed. He was a mourner who had never been led out of the funeral. He was a loyal heart with nowhere to put its loyalty. He had not disappeared after Haji Karim's death. He had been circling home, again and again, guided by a map drawn in scent and sorrow, until grief itself chained him to the last place that still felt like love. "Whose dog is this?" someone had asked when the lock first broke. The answer rose now without a voice. "He belongs to the one who will give his loyalty somewhere to live." The child took another step. The shepherd did not growl. The past leaned forward, listening for its own release. The afternoon light slanted through the trees, thin rays sneaking between the shed's cracked boards, illuminating swirls of dust like tiny golden spirits dancing in the air. The villagers had gathered close now, a thick circle of faces pressed with concern, their voices rising and falling in uncertain tones. The shepherd's chest heaved with shallow breaths, his ribs a map of suffering, his eyes darting between the people and the single, narrow exit behind them. Fear had made a fortress around him, and no gentle call seemed strong enough to break its walls. "Bring some food," someone urged. A boy sprinted toward the bakery, returning with a hunk of bread and still warm roti. Another fetched scraps of meat from his home. They placed the offerings near the shed's door, calling softly, their voices lowered to the kind of tones people used when luring pigeons. But the shepherd only bared his teeth, a low rumble vibrating from his throat. He pressed himself farther into the corner, chain clinking, his body trembling not with anger but with terror. Ropes were suggested next. A man tied a loop and tossed it gently toward the dog, hoping to catch him by the neck just enough to pull him to safety. But the moment the rope brushed against the straw, the shepherd lunged back, his body snapping taut against the chain, the sound of his bark sharp enough to sting ears. The toddler flinched at the noise, but she did not cry. Instead, she tilted her head and stared, as though listening to something no one else could hear. The villagers exchanged worried glances. "He won't let us near," muttered Master Iqbal, shaking his head. "Fear has made him its prisoner. He thinks every hand is an enemy." For a long moment, silence blanketed the shed. Only the child's quiet humming broke it, an off-key tune, half-remembered from lullabies sung to her at night. She crouched low, squatting on her tiny heels, her chubby hands clutching a twig she had picked up along the path. She tapped it softly against the ground in rhythm with her song. The shepherd's ears twitched. His growl faltered, uncertain. "Stay back, little one," her mother whispered sharply, reaching out to scoop her up. But before she could, the toddler wriggled free and toddled forward, her steps unsteady yet fearless. Gasps erupted from the crowd. "Stop her," someone hissed. "She'll be bitten." But the girl did not stop. She pressed one finger against her lips and said, in her tiny, breathy voice, "Shoot, good dog." Her words hung in the dusty air, fragile yet strangely powerful, as though innocence itself carried authority. The dog's body stiffened, his eyes locked on her. The child continued to inch closer, every step deliberate, her little shoes crunching the straw. She held out her small, open palm. "Good boy," she whispered, voice barely louder than the creak of the shed beams. "No hurt. I'm here." The villagers stood frozen, not daring to breathe. One wrong move, one startled sound, and the fragile thread between beast and child could snap. The shepherd's gaze flickered between her and the exit again, his breath quickening. Yet the child's eyes, round, bright, guileless, pulled at something buried deep within him. In those eyes, he did not see rope or chains, did not see a threat or trick. He saw the same purity he had once guarded at his master's feet, the same trust that had filled his world with meaning. Another step. Another whisper. "Tulton." She mispronounced the name she had overheard, but the sound, imperfect as it was, cut through the dog's fear like light through fog. His ears perked, his tail gave a single, trembling wag. The toddler reached the length of the chain now. She crouched down, tilting her head the way only children do when curiosity is louder than fear. The shepherd lowered his massive head, nostrils flaring, drinking in her scent. She smelled of milk, of earth, of safety. Then, in a moment that felt like the turning of the world itself, the shepherd released a deep, broken whimper. He leaned forward, his nose brushing against her tiny hand. The crowd gasped as the girl giggled softly, patting his muzzle with the gentle awkwardness of a child who has never learned caution. And then, like a dam bursting, the dog collapsed. His body folded to the ground, his legs giving way beneath him. The chain rattled once, then stilled. He lay his head against the child's lap, his eyes closing as if surrendering not just his fear, but his grief into her keeping. Tears pricked eyes all around. Old men who had buried friends wiped their faces. Mothers clutched their children tighter. The air thickened with the soundless prayer of 100 hearts witnessing trust reborn. The toddler, unfazed by the gravity of the moment, clapped her hands softly against the shepherd's fur. "Good doggy," she cooed, stroking him as though she had claimed him all her life. And the shepherd, who had snarled and fought every reaching hand, now lay trembling but still, his chest pressed against the earth, his breath steadying in the rhythm of her tiny heartbeat. The crowd broke into murmurs, relief spilling like water over dry ground. One man whispered, "It's as if she spoke a language none of us could." Another replied, "Not a language, just love." Slowly, gently, the chain was loosened. No fight, no bark, no panic followed. The shepherd didn't resist. His faith, fragile but whole, rested on the smallest shoulders in the village. The toddler stroked his head again, as if sealing the bond. And when the sun shifted lower, pouring its gold through the cracks in the roof, the villagers witnessed something they would never forget. The image of a broken dog laying his burdens down at the feet of a child, and the image of a child proving that sometimes the bravest heart is the smallest one. That afternoon, tears streaked dusty faces. It was not just relief for a freed animal. It was awe at the sight of innocence conquering despair, of trust returning where it had long been lost. And for the first time in years, the shed no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like the birthplace of hope. The night after the rescue was unlike any other in the little village. The tense, fearful air that had surrounded the locked shed dissolved into a fragile kind of relief, the kind that trembles at first before it grows steady. The German shepherd, once chained, snarling, and lost in shadows, was now free. But freedom did not mean safety, nor did it mean healing. The villagers knew this. That's why, when the toddler's parents offered to take him in for the night, no one objected. In fact, many nodded, as if they all felt some invisible thread had tied the dog and child together, a bond too pure to ignore. The shepherd limped into their home hesitantly, his paws patting across the cool floor, his ribs showing with each shallow breath. He paused at the doorway, his ears flicking back as though unsure whether he belonged here. But then came the sound, the tiny patter of bare feet. The toddler appeared, clutching a small blanket in her little hands, dragging it across the floor. She squealed with joy at the sight of him, her arms reaching up as though she wanted to scoop the massive animal into a hug. Her mother gently pulled her back, but the shepherd didn't growl, didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his head, sniffed her tiny fingers, and gave a weak wag of his tail. It was as if he already knew this child had saved him, and to her, he owed his trust. That night he was given food, nothing fancy, just scraps of meat and warm broth poured into a bowl. He ate slowly at first, suspicious, pausing between bites to glance around. But the toddler crouched beside him the whole time, whispering, "Good doggy, eat," as if encouraging him with her tiny words. Her presence seemed to make the food taste safer. He finished every last bite. Later, when the family prepared for bed, the shepherd paced the room, restless and unsure. He whined softly, circling near the door, until the toddler waddled over, tugging her blanket behind her. She plopped down right beside him, draped half of her blanket over his back, and patted his fur. "Sleep," she murmured, as if giving him an order he couldn't refuse. The dog let out a deep sigh and lowered himself beside her. His eyelids drooped, and for the first time in what felt like years, he slept without fear. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the transformation began. At first, he would startle at sudden noises, the clang of a pot, the slam of a door. He would retreat into corners, his body shaking, haunted by the ghosts of confinement. But every time, the toddler would find him. She would toddle over, her small hands clutching his ears, her forehead pressed to his muzzle. And he would calm, his panic melting under the steady warmth of her presence. She was his anchor in a storm no one else could see. Soon, a new rhythm formed. The dog became her shadow. If she waddled through the garden, he was there, padding softly beside her. If she sat in the grass, playing with daisies, he stretched out in the shade, his watchful eyes never leaving her. He followed her stroller into the market, trotting loyally at her side, startling strangers with his size yet melting hearts when they saw the devotion in his gaze. One afternoon, the toddler decided to play house. She dragged a small pillow across the floor, tucked her blanket carefully over the shepherd's broad back, and kissed the top of his head before whispering, "Good night, doggy." The villagers who had come to check on them laughed softly at the sight, their eyes misting with the kind of tears born from joy. It was the image of innocence wrapping itself around brokenness and healing it in ways no medicine could. Word of the bond spread quickly. Neighbors told the story in the market, how the dog who once growled at every hand now rested in the arms of a child. Children whispered about it at school, imagining the day they too might meet the brave shepherd. Old men retold the tale in tea shops, shaking their heads in wonder, claiming they had never seen such loyalty and such tenderness so perfectly joined. The dog's strength returned slowly. His ribs filled out, his coat grew shinier, and his eyes, once dull and clouded, began to gleam again. Yet even as his body healed, he never forgot the little girl who had crawled into his fear and pulled him out. She was his new master, his family, his reason. Every step she took, he mirrored. Every laugh she let out, his ears perked to catch it. When she cried, he pressed his nose against her cheek until her sobs turned to giggles. And soon, the villagers noticed something else. At night, when the family slept, the shepherd would sit beside the toddler's crib. His large body curled close, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. No shadow, no nightmare dared approach her under his watch. He had taken his place as her guardian, not because anyone had asked him to, but because his heart demanded it. It wasn't long before the entire village began to see them as inseparable. "She saved him," the elders whispered, but perhaps he saved her too, because in her laughter, the shepherd had found reason again, and in his loyalty, she had discovered what devotion truly meant. And so, what had begun as a day of terror at a locked shed grew into a story of healing that spread across the town like fire. It was told with awe, with tenderness, and with gratitude. The toddler and the shepherd became more than a pair. They became a symbol of courage, of innocence, and of love that could stitch even the deepest wounds closed. By then, no one in the village doubted it. The shepherd was no longer just a rescue dog. He was family. He was her shadow, her protector, her guardian angel wrapped in fur. And wherever the toddler went, a faithful presence followed, silent, steadfast, and unbreakable. The days stretched into weeks, and the story of the shepherd and the toddler no longer belonged to just their family, it belonged to the whole village. What had once been a frightening memory of muffled cries inside a locked shed slowly transformed into a tale spoken with reverence, almost like a prayer. The shed still stood there, its wooden walls weathered, its lock broken, its roof sagging in parts. But it no longer carried the weight of sorrow. Instead, when villagers walked past it, they paused, not in fear or pity, but in quiet respect. For the shed had changed meaning. It was no longer just a place of darkness, where grief and despair had chained a loyal heart. It had become something else entirely, a reminder that love, even when battered and forgotten, never truly disappears. Loyalty doesn't vanish with time, it lingers, hiding in corners, waiting for the moment it can rise again. The dog himself was proof of that truth. For years, he had been tethered, not by iron chains, but by grief, an invisible leash stronger than any metal. He had returned again and again to that shed, unable to let go of a master who was gone, unwilling to abandon the love that had defined his life. Many would call that sorrow, a stubborn refusal to move forward. But the toddler had shown the villagers, and perhaps the dog himself, that it was something deeper. It was devotion, pure and unyielding. And devotion, when met with compassion, can turn grief into healing. In the dog's journey, the villagers began to see a reflection of their own hidden wounds. Everyone carries loss in some form, whether it's the absence of a loved one, the weight of broken dreams, or the silent ache of time passing too quickly. And too often, adults bury these wounds, pushing them into locked sheds of the heart, places no one enters anymore. But children are different. They don't see the world through walls of cynicism or resignation. They see truth with startling clarity. That toddler had seen what no one else dared to, that the cries from the shed weren't just noise, they were pleas. She had pointed, insisted, and refused to be ignored. While adults dismissed it, trapped in their logic and routines, she followed her heart. And in doing so, she rescued more than just a dog. She rescued hope itself. It became clear, then, that sometimes it takes the smallest voices to remind us of the loudest truths. That compassion is not weakness, but strength. That loyalty is not a chain, but a light. That healing often arrives not through grand gestures, but through small acts of love. A soft hand, a whispered word, a blanket shared. The shepherd's healing mirrored the healing of the shed itself. Once a symbol of sorrow, it now became a story told to children by their grandparents at night. Do you see that place? That's where loyalty waited. And that's where love found it again. Villagers began to keep the shed standing, repairing parts of it, not to restore its original purpose, but to honor its new one. It became a quiet monument, not of loss, but of devotion transformed. Parents would point to it as they walked with their children, reminding them, this is where a child's courage saved a life. Some said prayers near it, others left flowers at its door. The shed was no longer abandoned. It had become a vessel of memory and hope. And the shepherd himself, he no longer looked toward the shed with longing. Instead, he looked forward, his eyes following the toddler wherever she went. His devotion had shifted. He had found healing, not by forgetting his past, but by finding new purpose in the present. The child's innocent love had given him permission to release his grief, to let go of sorrow without letting go of loyalty. The narrator's voice deepens here. Sometimes, children remind us of truths adults forget. In the rush of life, in the weight of responsibility, grown-ups often convince themselves that pain must be hidden, that loyalty must be tempered, that grief should be silent. But children remind us that healing begins by listening, to cries in the dark, to hearts still grieving, to the call of compassion that refuses to be quieted. The shepherd's story was more than an animal's survival. It was a parable written in flesh and fur. It taught that loyalty, even when scarred by grief, can become the foundation of new beginnings. It showed that compassion, even when offered by the smallest of hands, has the power to restore what sorrow had broken. And it proved that courage is not always about facing great battles, but sometimes about taking small steps into the dark, guided only by the light of love. So the lesson lingers. The shed became a symbol. The shepherd became a guardian. The toddler became a teacher. And the village itself learned that devotion does not end when life does. It carries on in memories, in places, in silent gestures that echo long after the world has moved forward. And if you listen closely, the story whispers a truth meant for all of us. Grief does not vanish. Loyalty does not fade. Love does not die. They wait quietly for compassion to awaken them. And sometimes, it takes the heart of a child to remind us of the courage to love again. This wasn't just the story of a dog in a shed. It wasn't only about rusted chains, broken wood, or the cries that echoed in the dark. No, this was a story of love that never gave up. A story of loyalty so deep it refused to be silenced, even when the world had already moved on. The German shepherd's vigil inside that locked shed wasn't just a tale of sorrow, it was a testament. It showed us that love doesn't end when someone is gone. It lingers, waiting in the shadows, holding on, hoping to be remembered. And sometimes, healing comes not through strength or time, but through the smallest, most innocent hands, a child's touch, a baby's voice, a heart unafraid to care. The shed that once stood as a prison of grief has now become a monument of hope. And the shepherd who once trembled in darkness now walks in the light of devotion, guarding not loss but new love. So if this story touched your heart, let it not stop here. Share it. Share it with someone who still believes that loyalty can outlive loss, that compassion can awaken healing, and that love, real, unwavering love, never fades. Because sometimes, the world just needs to be reminded that love is eternal.